Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Do Americans care about foreign policy? As a nation whose security has always been a function of continents and oceans rather than rivers or mountains, and fortunate in its neighbors, interest in global issues has often been solely a matter of responding to attacks. 20 years ago, in the aftermath of 9/11, Americans woke up to the reality of a world inhabited by Islamist terrorists who wanted to kill them. But 2 decades later, and after the sobering experience provided by inconclusive and ultimately unsuccessful wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, if there is anything that both major parties seem to agree about these days, it's their desire to avoid foreign entanglements and especially violent conflicts in which their country never seems interested in winning. But the problem with foreign policy is that as much as Americans would like it to go away, the challenges don't go away. Even withdrawals that are inherently popular, such as that from Afghanistan, can go so badly as to remind the country why they got into the conflict in the first place. So even as Americans obsess about their current dismal economic situation with raging inflation and a supply chain crisis, the question remains, what are the chief threats to the country's security? Is it climate change, as the Biden administration and many of its allies insist? Should Americans be focused instead on the consequences of an ongoing administration effort to return to a policy of appeasement of Iran and its nuclear ambitions? Or is the real peril to the country a budding conflict with a rising communist power in China, which is challenging the U.S. on both economic and military fronts? How much should we be paying attention to the Islamist regime in Turkey? Or to what American defeat in Afghanistan at the hands of the Taliban portends for the future of Islamist terrorist groups? And what about the sinister threats from some of the same actors in terms of how vulnerable the American economy can be to cyber attacks? And what do the rising record amounts of illegal immigration and porous border in the South, how does that figure into the equation? To discuss these issues, as well as the failure of American journalism in covering these topics fairly and adequately, we're pleased to have with us today someone who has both reported and analyzed on foreign policy for a generation and founded one of the most important centers for serious thinking on the subject. Clifford May is the founder and president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan institute focusing on national security created immediately after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, whose scholars and experts have shaped policies on legislation on terrorism, nonproliferation, human rights, Islamism, democratization, and related issues. A veteran news reporter, foreign correspondent, and editor at the New York Times and other publications, he has covered stories around the world. And his writing has also appeared on the Wall Street Journal, National Review Commentary, USA Today, The Atlantic, and many other publications. Cliff May, welcome to Top Story.
Jonathan, it's great to be with you. I've read your work for years and years and years, listened to you on the podcast. I don't think we've ever met before, so it's good to do so even virtually, although be nice over adult beverages, I suppose.
It is indeed, and I'll take you up on that the next time I'm in Washington, perhaps. We're starting to get out in the post-COVID world.
Indeed.
Well, Cliff, we have a lot of territory to cover, but I want to start with the aftermath of the Afghanistan debacle. While the disgrace attached to that disaster seems to have helped turn public opinion against President Biden, I don't sense that many Americans are, despite all their anger about it, seem to be terribly concerned with the consequences for the region or the war against terrorism, or even the fact that there are American and Afghan allies were left behind and haven't yet even been extricated. What do you think that says about the difficulty of getting Americans to focus on foreign policy issues, as well as the problem that the withdrawal itself has created for the region?
Well, look, people are don't know what I think a lot of people do understand that the way it ended in Afghanistan was shameful and really disastrous, that America should not, especially after 20 years, be essentially surrendering to our enemies who reestablished the status quo ante the Taliban's close allies, Al Qaeda. I think they're disturbed, but it's, people go on with their lives until and unless we're hit again in some catastrophic way as we were on 9/11. And young people don't even remember what that was like and what that meant and how that shook up the nation. People will if it happens again, and it certainly could. The idea that we can control the situation over the horizon, I think, is ludicrous. The military people I talk to say when we're talking over the horizon, we're talking from too far. People don't understand to a great extent that we were in Afghanistan with a very small contingent of American and European troops, managing to prevent the reestablishment of the Taliban and the reestablishment of Al Qaeda with a haven and refuge in that country. And we were protecting in Kabul and other provincial and other capitals or other major cities a generation of people who were learning, women who were emancipated to a great extent. There were real accomplishments, but no president that we've had in recent years, maybe ever, was making the case that, hey, we have a mission in Afghanistan and it's succeeding. Don't forget when President Biden came into the White House, again, not Kabul and not a single major population center was under Taliban control. The Taliban were in the boondocks in the rural regions, and we hadn't had an attack on American soil because of the Taliban or because of Al Qaeda over these years, and we had very few casualties over the last few years. But there is on both what I call the isolationist right, and on the left there was this desire, let's end this longest of wars, which I also think is a misconception. Afghanistan is a battle in a much larger war, and 20 years is nothing in terms of warfare, historically speaking. I mean, the Islamic conquest through jihad of the Iberian Peninsula took place in the 700s, and war continued in what is now Spain and Portugal until 1492. 700
Right.
years. That's a long war. 20 years where you're essentially keeping the Taliban from achieving their ambitions, keeping Al Qaeda down. You have a forward operating base, which is very useful, not just for Afghanistan, but for the entire Indo-Pacific, where you have dozens of other terrorist organizations. And by the way, Afghanistan borders the People's Republic of China as well. So this was a great event. To have Bagram Air Base was an amazing and wonderful asset that we had, which probably the Chinese are likely to just take over now. We just gave it up. But it's look, it is a failure, even of I have to say, of think tanks like mine, that we couldn't persuade people such as President Biden and his advisors, and to a great extent President Trump, who didn't seem to understand this situation, that this is a low intensity conflict over a long period of time is probably necessary when you're fighting people who believe that their war, their jihad, which began in the 7th century, will continue until such time as they prevail. So it's been misunderstood. It's been misreported. We have America always has been an isolationist country. I share the desire, in a way, not to be involved in the world's problems, but the oceans do not protect us as they once did. And we need, I think, to be realistic about all of the national security challenges we face. And now we've had a significant defeat. And yes, people don't recognize it. Hopefully, maybe they won't. In 2 or 3 years, there won't be something terrible that happens as a result of this. But that's hardly guaranteed.
Yeah, that's the point. And I think you touched on it. I mentioned it. This is, you speak of the isolationist right, the isolationist left. Well, I think in both political parties, irrespective of their stands on other issues, it's not just the extremes. It's not just the wings of the party. That became the consensus position. Certainly, President Trump and his critique, if you want to call it that, of foreign wars, of neoconservatism, something that people like Tucker Carlson talk about a lot. That really resonated with the base and most Republican voters. And certainly Democrats were never that enthusiastic, although for a while, and when they were for the quote unquote good war in Afghanistan, so they could criticize the so-called bad war in Iraq, but that was a long time ago. Would it really, in order for the United States to sort of take these threats seriously, is it really just a matter of whether we get attacked again?
Well, it may be, because it's going to be hard for any politician, given the current public state of public opinion, to make a strong case for defending forward, as we call it at FDD, that it's important for us to be. You can't do what we need to do in the world if we're going to remain the leader of the free world, and that there's some question of whether we will. We can't do that all from Fort Benning and from Fort Hood. We have to be out there. And just 2 points. One is, if you wanted to leave Afghanistan or almost leave Afghanistan, there was a way one could do it. I would be opposed to it because I think, again, there's so much that was important there. But you could do it. It would take a few years. You'd have to make the transition so that the Afghan military is less dependent on the U.S. than it is now. Though even so, I think you would need some forces there. Contractors, because you don't have enough mechanics for the helicopters. You want to make sure, if you have air force at Bagram, that you defend it properly. A lot of things, but again, you don't need a lot of troops. Again, we had like 2,500 troops when Biden came into office. The military people I talk about say, 5,000 plus the Europeans, that would be fine. 10,000 would be great. That's a small contingent. We have more troops than that. We have 28,000 troops, say, in South Korea. They've been there since the Korean War, which did not end with a victory or defeat, but only an armistice. But having 28,000 troops in South Korea has at least provided stability. If those troops were not there, the South, which is now a free and democratic country, was not for a very long time. It would have been overrun a long time ago. We have troops in Germany, of course, quite a few of them. Again, they've been doing a good job there, not fighting, but prepared to fight, and letting the Russians, before that the Soviets, know that you don't want to take advantage of any weaknesses you may see in Western Europe. We have troops in Italy. My son is a U.S. Army officer in Italy right now. It's a NATO deployment. That's important. We have troops in a lot of places in the world we could have had in Afghanistan. And again, the Indo-Pacific is so strategically important. But it's hard for a politician to say, let me explain the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific to you. Let me explain why forward bases are useful to us in an emergency, or also to keep our adversaries at bay. Very hard to do. But that said, I think it could have been done if a president could have said, look, what we're doing in Afghanistan is a useful investment. It protects American national security. It's helping us. It's helping the Afghan people. We're doing some good things there. And the price is not high, either in blood or treasure at this point. And it really hasn't been for quite some time, and that could have been maintained. One could advise a politician on how to talk about this. I think people and let me make this other point. I think there are those politicians who can and do, and I'm not sure it's going to bring them great electoral success, but I don't think it'll bring them great harm. If I think of the politicians who I admire most, because I think they have a realistic view of the world, I think of Tom Cotton, I think of Mike Gallagher, I think of Dan Crenshaw, I think of Mike Waltz. These guys are all former military guys. They understand they understand why we were there, and why it was useful, and why it was a terrible error to get out at all, and especially to get out in the chaotic and disorganized way and bloody way that President Biden did.
One more question about Afghanistan. What's the prospect of a revival of Afghanistan as sort of the home office for international terrorism, the way it was before 9/11? We've heard a lot from the Biden administration about how pragmatic the Taliban are going to be. I think that's probably wish being father to the thought. But is there any chance that it won't become again basically the international boarding school for homeless terrorists?
We don't entirely know. The country is in terrible financial shape. It's very hard to say how the Taliban will weigh its obligations and its duties as brothers with Al Qaeda and others, and whether it will take seriously its promise, which is, Taliban spokesmen say, hey, we made a promise, we will keep it. Who knows, that we would not allow terrorism against America to continue or to resume from our territory. They're hoping, of course, to get international aid. They need it badly. They're hoping the U.S. will relieve some sanctions. They need it badly. I think we really don't know. And that's part of the reason you don't do something like that we've just done without having some sense of here's what will happen, and here are the contingencies, and here are the contingency plans. There are plenty of other places Al Qaeda, of course, is. Al Qaeda is in more countries now than it was on 9/11. It's in Africa, it's in the Arabian Peninsula, it's in India, it's in a lot of different places. The Taliban may say, look, guys, there are things you can do here and things we don't want you to do because we do have other obligations. There are those, and there are serious people who say, look, the Taliban is jihadist, it's Islamist, it's all of the above. It's going to be terrible to women, minorities, homosexuals, all of that. They're not as internationalist, expansionist as, say, the Islamic State. Which is insistent upon moving towards caliphate as quickly as possible. That's why the Islamic State split from Al Qaeda. Actually, they were in many ways more aggressive and radical, and they're pushing in Afghanistan too. That may also be a distraction and a problem for the Taliban if the Islamic State says, you're fair prey for us. We'd rather take this country over and have the emirate of Afghanistan as part of the caliphate that we intend to build. Don't forget, we, under President Trump, we did a good job of decimating the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, depriving the Islamic State of a territory larger than Britain. But they were not defeated. Their war goes on. They had to reorganize in a different way, and they're in many countries too. So yes, these are forever
that
wars.
was a good example of the kind of conflicts that Americans like. President Trump unleashed the military in a way that President Obama didn't, and then he could say that we kicked their butts. And then he wanted to just move on, and Americans like that idea. So that's why, of course, they're still there.
That's right. And Americans have an idea of warfare based on World War II, World War I. I think it should be relatively brief. You have a declaration of war at the beginning, and then you have a VJ Day or VE Day, and
you have a parade at the end.
And our enemies say, "Well, that's nice if that's what you want, but that's not the way we do it, and that's not the way we have been doing it since the 7th century. We have a different idea." But a low intensity conflict that doesn't look. Tens of thousands of people, millions of people died in World War II. In this low-intensity conflict, yes, it's a forever war. Yes, it goes on, but it's low intensity, which means you don't have your life can go on. You can do other things, but your enemies we do not get to decide with our enemies getting a vote what type of conflict we are going to be in. We might prefer tank divisions coming in and defeating less technologically adept tank divisions. But our enemies are not going to accommodate us in this way. It's very unfair of them. It's very cruel of them. But it's also the reality, and it's time we kind of faced it. And it's, again, by historical standards, this is the norm. World War II was not the norm. Long wars have, going back as far as you can, been what was expected and what took place.
Yeah, that's very true. Turning our gaze slightly to the left on the map, it seems to me that aside from climate change, President Biden's priority on foreign policy does appear to be trying somehow to convince the Iranians to re-enter the very weak nuclear deal concluded by his former boss, President Obama. But Tehran has been playing its cards very close, and to date has refused something that surprised, I think, a lot of people in the administration, because they thought that when John Kerry advised them, just wait for Trump to be defeated and then you can have your nuclear deal back, they thought they would join the nuclear deal, but they haven't been. And even as Iran edges closer to its nuclear ambitions, because it's been cheating on the weak deal, and indeed the deal wouldn't have prevented them in the long run from getting the bomb. Do you think the Iranians are going to be able to use their leverage to force Biden to agree to even more concessions somehow for the sake of just having a piece of paper signed? Or do they blow off the United States altogether, refuse to rejoin the 2015 deal, and just blissfully go on slowly or quickly towards a nuclear weapon?
Well, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they're very clever negotiators, and we have not been for many years in the U.S. I fear. We were not, if you think going back to the negotiations in the 1990s with North Korea, President Clinton.
Conducted by the same person, I might add.
Wendy Sherman was
Sherman.
instrumental in those and these, and of course the idea was to stop North Korea from getting nuclear weapons and missiles that could deliver them. We gave them all sorts of things. There was an agreement that was trotted out as a great success for the U.S., and of course we gave them what we gave them, and they have nuclear weapons, and they're developing increasingly reliable missiles to deliver them anywhere on the planet. Terrible mistake. The JCPOA also, it was from the very beginning a very good agreement for the Islamic Republic of Iran, not a good agreement for us, because it at most delayed the Tehran's acquisition of nuclear weapons and missiles to deliver them anywhere in the world. At most delayed. There's a tendency of American presidents too often to say, if I can just kick this can down the road, at least it won't be my fault. Or maybe historians, but I won't have that on my. And then President Trump, of course, pulled out and imposed sanctions, maximum pressure, although I don't think it was ever maximum, but it was substantial. It was significant. The Iranians at this point are going to negotiate for the best deal they can get. If they only, I think that it appears that President Biden and his advisors, of course, Robert Malley in particular, who's the special envoy for Iran, who has always, I think, been very soft on the Islamic Republic, but also Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and to my disappointment, Tony Blinken, think that this will be a triumph to re-enter this agreement, which and many of the sunset provisions when the restrictions end have already come, and others are coming up. So if they can just get relieved of some of the sanctions pressure and get some economic, a little more money into the system, that would be good for them. And then they can go on to do what they want to do, which is to build nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. And they're, as you know, threatening Israel with genocide on a fairly regular basis. The world says, never again, but they don't seem to. You hear very little criticism that they're threatening genocide. And of course, death to America not only has been the chant since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution there, which I covered as a young journalist, it remains today a chant heard in government and religious offices and mosques, and they continue to. So, our best hope, in a way, is that the Iranians say, look, and particularly the Supreme Leader Khamenei says, I just don't want any deal with those Americans. I don't like them. I don't trust them. I just don't. We're getting some economic relief from the Chinese and from others. Let's not give them anything whatsoever. I think in a way that would be a better outcome than the one that President Biden and his advisors have in mind at the moment. And the only question is how egregious it's going to be in terms of what they offer and what they give. They refuse, and I understand why they refuse. They refuse to say, okay, this is really important. Obviously, that anything we do with the Islamic Republic should be a treaty, and we'll submit it to the Senate for ratification. They know they won't get ratification for anything that the Iranians would agree to, so they say, well, we just don't need to submit it for Senate ratification. We'll just call it an executive agreement. Of course, any such agreement that they make on the basis of the president's authority alone can be withdrawn from very simply by the next president, because without legislative agreement, it doesn't represent the country, really. It represents the office of the president.
Yeah, well, that was, John Kerry was very frank about why the JCPOA was not submitted to the Senate as it should have been as a treaty, because he knew he couldn't pass it. He said, well, it's impossible to pass treaties anymore, so let's have treaties and call them something else.
And
You
this point too,
mentioned,
they was submitted to the UN for the UN's endorsement, and then you have the Iranians and others saying, well, if the UN has endorsed it, it now has the force of international law. That's not true, but it is a theory that a lot of people evidently believe. This is a whole other question, but the UN is not, for the most part, a lawmaking body. It's the endorsement of the General Assembly or even the Security Council in most conditions does not establish international law. But most people don't know what international law is, which is why people say, well, America is violated international law by withdrawing from the JCPOA. And a lot of people think, oh, yeah, they did. Or the Israelis are violating international law because they're in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, or whatever reasons. People just say this is international law. We don't have an international Supreme Court. We don't have an international legislature, really. But people just make it up, and then of course you have various groups, particularly nonprofit so-called human rights groups, saying, it has become customary law because so many people have accepted it. So therefore, America is in violation of international law. Israel's in violation of it. Actually, and those are the ones that they usually use, because you don't hear a lot of people saying, well, which is true, China is in violation of international law because they had a treaty on Hong Kong and they violated it. That was a treaty.
Right.
Treaties are the foundation of international law, not statements from the UN or the UN Secretary General or the General Assembly.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the whole question of international law. And if there was anything that would get, I think, most Americans' hair on fire, it would be the idea that they actually are being, that it's not a conspiracy, but that, the United Nations actually would be assuming the right to impose laws on the United States. That would not go over very well with the American electorate.
Well, again, this is a division because you have, that's very true, I would say, on the right for sure. On the left, there are those, I would call them globalists.
I would say that certainly the foreign policy establishment would be for it, and I think certainly in the intersectional left.
Thank you. Yes.
But I think even moderate Democrats would be pretty queasy about about expecting their voters to support that.
I would hope so.
Yeah. Let me go one step further, deeper on Iran. I think you're right. Iran, thinks it has nothing to lose in these negotiations. But, and that there is no real credible threat from the United States to do anything about it. I mean, President, you mentioned sort of kicking the can down the road. I mean, earlier this year, President Biden said, well, they won't get a bomb on my watch. Well, actually, even if they re-entered the JCPOA and then when it expired, they built the bomb, well, that wouldn't be on his watch, even if he were somehow elected to a second term. So yes, that's true. But there have been moments, especially when speaking, I think, to Jewish audiences, Secretary of State Blinken, for one, has at least hinted at the idea that everything is still on the table, as President Obama used to say. I mean, I don't think he was very credible in that, if Iran breaks out to a nuclear weapon, that the United States would do something about it militarily because it's a threat to American and Western security. Forget even the genocidal threats against Israel. So my question to you, as somebody who's really been following this issue closely, as FDD has done, in depth, is there really a credible American military threat that can be leveled toward Iran? Does Iran spend a moment worrying about that? And secondarily, Israel has, especially in recent months, talked about the possibility of doing something unilaterally themselves if the Americans aren't going to do it. Does Israel really have a credible, military option to stop Iran's nuclear weapons? And could it do it in the face of opposition from a Biden administration?
Well, most importantly, I would say Supreme Leader Khamenei and President Raisi, I have to imagine when they've discussed this, they said, they can say all options are on the table. They can threaten. America has great military power. They're not going to use it against us. Don't even worry about this. This is a question of what they're going to give us economically or what they won't. But from a military point of view, let's not even worry about this. Pretend that we're talking about Ecuador or something. It's not happening.
So you're saying Biden and Blinken and Sullivan have zero credibility
I think they have zero
if they're even
credibility
hinting at
in
a threat.
terms of saying, hey, you guys, if you force us to the wall, we have the military options and we will consider them seriously. I don't think that's believed in Tehran at all. With Trump, I think they might have, because Trump was famously unpredictable. You just never knew what the guy was going to do. He killed Soleimani. That was the head of the Quds force. I don't think they expected that. I think that made them sit up and take notice and say, well, we just don't know what this guy's going to do. I don't think with Biden, I don't think they think that this is not a problem. Who knows who comes in next? As for the Israelis, it would be helpful for the Israelis at least to have strong American support for anything that they decide to do. I'm not sure they can count on that currently, less so if the JCPOA, of course, is being negotiated, or if the JCPOA is revived, because Biden will say, you see, we've solved the problem. As I said, we've solved the problem with North Korea. Or as Obama said, I've solved the problem. He hadn't, but they'll say that, and that'll make it harder for Israel. Israel also, obviously, is a tiny little country that has great military prowess for its size and within the region. But this will be challenging if they decide they have to do something. Of course, Israel, on many occasions, has done things that were challenging or seemed impossible. This is harder than what
its covert operations inside of Iran have been very impressive, obviously.
Very impressive.
But that's a very different thing than taking out a nuclear program.
Very different. I mean, they did destroy the Iraqi nuclear facilities and those in Syria built by the North Koreans, I would remind people. But the Iranians have learned from this, and Tehran has made it more difficult to destroy the facilities by putting them underground in caves and under mountains and that sort of thing. On the other hand, I put nothing past the Israelis. A former Israeli general whose name you'd know, I won't say it, he said, Cliff, let me explain something to you. If we do something about Iran and your reaction is to say, yeah, that's what I thought they'd do, then we've failed. What people like you should be saying is, oh my God, I never expected them to do it that way. What an interesting solution to the problem. And if you think through that, what does that mean? Well, who knows? They identify all the facilities, and every one of them requires electricity, and that electricity goes off for a prolonged length of time. Every one of those facilities has air coming in if it's underground, and that air stops coming. I mean, everyone thinks this has to be done by planes and missiles and bombs, and that may be the case, but there may be other things that the Israelis come up with, again, so that people like you and people like me say, oh, didn't expect that one, did I? And I think that's the way the Israelis try to think, because they are always under an existential threat. Again, America can lose wars in Vietnam and lose wars, and I think that's very bad for America and for the future of the free world. We can talk about why that is and how dangerous that is, but the glide path is a lot longer for the U.S. than it would be for Israel if it came under attack, being as small as it is with as small a population as it has.
Yeah, well, I think that's quite true. Now, with respect to China, there's been some talk that I've been following from the foreign policy establishment and its favorite venues like the New York Times, that their main fear about what I think many Americans are increasingly thinking of as the America's rival in the 21st century is that there would be a new Cold War brewing between Beijing and Washington. And I've sensed more concern about that possibility and in the administration than about China's provocations with respect to Taiwan or its efforts to gain influence in the United States or its genocidal policies against its own people and the Uyghurs. What, if anything, do you think it will take for this administration or for American public opinion in this country and in the center and the left to start taking China seriously as a threat to the American future?
Well, I would have to say that the previous administration did begin to take China seriously. I would give a lot of credit to H.R. McMaster for that as National Security Advisor, for Matt Pottinger, who is a really brilliant young guy in the National Security Council and a China specialist. Nadia Shadlow, who wrote who had the pen for the major U.S. government strategies. I think they made a strong case that we are in a Cold War with China. China believes so. We can pretend, we can say no, we're not. But once again, China gets a vote, and and clearly Xi Jinping has great ambitions for himself and for the Middle Kingdom and for the People's Republic of China. It's not just hegemony in Asia, though that's clearly the reason he's built military bases on reefs in the South China Sea in an attempt to make it into a Chinese lake, and other things he's doing, the threats against Taiwan. But more broadly, I think he sees China replacing America. And I think this is a serious problem we really do need to think through and make some decisions on, because Britain was the global hegemon for a very long time. At the end of World War II, the nation was exhausted in many ways, didn't want the responsibility anymore, handed the torch to the United States, and we took it. If we want to hand over the torch now, and I do think a lot of Americans would like to, we have a problem, because there are good nations in the world, but they're not strong. And there are strong nations in the world, but they are not good. So we can't hand this torch to Denmark. We can't hand this torch to the European Union currently. We can't hand it back to Britain. China will gladly take it. Russia is not even up to taking it, but Russia would, under Putin, would like to.
They'd like it, yes.
Well, he'd like to. I think he's a very clever man, and at least would like to expand and reconstitute the Russian Empire. That's been the job of czars and commissars going back a long way, and he is in a sense, both. And just as what does Iran want? Well, they want to dominate the Middle East. The Saudis get that, the Emiratis get that, the Bahrainis get that, the Israelis get that, and then go beyond, but they see they have to take it one step at a time, although they've been for a long time all over South America, for example, and they're in Venezuela, for example. But they know there are some limits at the moment. But China, they have a strategy, and it's a complex strategy for replacing the U.S. as the most important nation and powerful nation on earth. By the way, they're pursuing this very effectively and have been for some time at the United Nations. Most people don't really get that and understand the ways in which they have been doing that by taking over. What they've been doing is sort of taking over various UN agencies and making the priorities of these agencies not multilateral but unilateral for China. The most obvious example is the World Health Organization, where they clearly made sure that the World Health Organization was essentially echoing their propaganda on the pandemic that came out of China.
Out of China, yes.
And we've not pushed back. I mean, Dr. Tedros, who's the head of it, as you may know, he's up for re-election. And he's been nominated by like 16 European countries for re-election. The U.S. hasn't. When the election comes around in May, he will probably be the only candidate. The Trump administration pulled out of the WHO, stopped funding. The Biden administration has resumed funding, made no demands for reforms as part of that, just as the U.S. is going back in to the UN Human Rights Council, which is also dominated by China, by Russia, by all sorts of bad actors. And now there's something new, by the way, that you may not have heard of, called the Friends of the UN. And it's China and Russia and Venezuela and Qatar and Pakistan, and it's going to be a caucus inside the UN claiming that sanctions, for example, violate international law. That's part of their claim, and that they want to get back to the real meaning of the United Nations, which means take it away from the U.S. and reduce the U.S. there,
and to give impunity
to
rogue nations.
What's that?
In essence, right? And to give impunity to rogue nations.
And well, that's what does the UN Human Rights Council do? It gives immunity to rogue nations. And they can be preoccupied with criticizing the U.S. and using Israel as a whipping boy. That's really all they do, and they do it on the American dime, because We are the largest contributor of money to that organization, to the UN Human Rights Council, that goes to the general funds, as well as to the WHO, which goes directly to them, and other UN. So the UN is being taken over but that's part of this larger strategy that includes military. The People's Republic of China has a larger navy now than the U.S. does. And they are going to make the world safe for authoritarianism, for tyrants, and for human rights violators if they can. We have to think if we're okay with letting that happen, because if we do not stand, we may be weary of of shouldering the responsibility of global leadership. But if we decide not to do it, and we might, again, we should understand what the world is going to look like for our grandchildren.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, we've seen, especially in the last couple of months, in terms of the conduct of Biden climate czar John Kerry and the administration as a whole, that this administration truly believes that climate issues are more important than traditional national security threats, such as those from China or even Chinese genocide, which Kerry has been downplaying in order to get them to sign on to some climate agreements. That's a stand that, frankly, has gained the applause of many in the mainstream media and America's European allies, and even from sort of popular culture in the United States, which agrees about about climate change and about it being the real priority. What do you think about this new consensus about what Americans should be most afraid of? And what do you think the consequences are for the American economy and as well as for our security?
Yeah, I do wonder if everybody in the Biden administration really sincerely believes what President Biden said at the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, which is that climate change is the existential threat to human existence. The redundancy of that phrase aside, does he really believe that, or is he cynically using the threat of climate change?
Yeah, I was about to say, does he believe it? Never mind everybody else in the administration.
I don't. Yeah, because the political reason to say that is, don't worry about Afghanistan. Don't worry about inflation. Don't worry about the migrants by the tens of thousands coming across the border. Worry about climate change and give me what I need. I want money. I want power. I may have to ask you to sacrifice some freedom, maybe some sovereignty. But you have to, because as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said 3 years ago, we only have a dozen years before the Earth comes to an end. And if that's true, this dates me, but don't buy any long-playing records, but but there are serious scientists who should be listened to, and they're not, who say this is absolute nonsense. Steve Koonin was the top scientist at the Energy Department under the Obama administration. Bjorn Lomborg of the Copenhagen Consensus, a very good organization. Mark Mills at Manhattan Institute. These are not far right wingers, and they're not climate deniers. They're saying, listen, climate change is a problem. It is. We have to deal with it, but it's not. We have no reason to believe it's an existential threat. Not in 10 years, not in 20 years, by any means. And what's more, they've been saying we need to deal with it with realistic policies. And what you should have learned, we should have learned from the COP26 conference, which was the 26th time all these people flew in on their private planes to blow hot air about climate, is you're not going to solve the problem by attempting to reduce emissions globally. That's just not going to happen. If the U.S. were to stop all its emissions tomorrow, absolutely zero, you would not.
The Earth stood still kind of scenario, yeah.
Well, you wouldn't change the predicted warming by a measurable amount. China's not going to do it. They're building coal plants every day. India's not going to do it. Africa's not going to do it. And they can't do it because they have to worry about poverty. So there are other things you can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change and deal with the problem over time. But you have to get off the idea that the way that Kerry is pursuing it is going to work, because it will not. But they're scaring people, young people particularly, who don't know better, for no good reason. Anyhow, I can tell you about the things that Lomborg and Mills and Koonin are suggesting in terms of policy responses, and they're good policy responses, but they're not responses to an imminent catastrophe or emergency. They're, hey, we have to help ourselves and others around the world adapt, and we have to mitigate this, and we have to slow climate change if we can over time, and make sure that we ameliorate the bad effects. There will be some good effects too, by the way, that people should understand. More carbon dioxide is good for growing food, for example. There's
Well,
a
that was
reason why
historically,
huh?
yeah, wasn't that the historic, we've had, people who think that the climate doesn't change don't know history.
It's always
Obviously,
changed.
it has always changed. There were, Greenland was green when the Vikings landed there, or at least to some extent, and we know that the climate, there were little ice ages and warming periods, and usually warming periods were good for humanity because it meant that there could be more food and people didn't starve. But that's not the way we think about it now.
Well, yeah, and then there's the question of is it in part anthropogenic? Is it man-made activity? And there's kind of religious element. Well, the chances are, from my reading, is yeah, man-made activity has an influence on climate, absolutely. But in a way, so what? We do what we do. We do what we do. It's not like a sin for which we have to repent.
But actually, it is, isn't it?
Well, that's the way it is viewed. That we did this.
Sort of Greta Thunberg and the environmental movement.
I need to say this. Because the people on the left who claim to be humanists are pushing this, like AOC. I lived in Africa for 3 years. Let me tell you, if you do not allow fossil fuels in Africa, you are saying we're going to leave these people in dire poverty and not allow them to advance, develop, and prosper. If you're an African farmer, you need a tractor. And you're not going to plug it in. It's not going to come from Tesla. You need a truck to take your produce to market before it rots. You do it by donkey. It's not the same thing. And we're not. And these, if you want these people to have a roof over their head, and I mean this in the literal sense, if you want them to be able to eat meat occasionally, if you want them to have a wristwatch and a radio, basically, they are going to need fossil fuels. And at least two African presidents have talked about it. They say, well, we'll give them aid. Well, again, I lived in Africa. I see what happens with the aid. It doesn't get to the farmers, and it doesn't help them. No. And actually, you know what? The farmers want to grow their crops and deliver it to market and get paid for it. They don't want a welfare check. That's not really what they're interested in.
Yeah, I think those are important points. In the time we have left, I want to switch subjects. And talk about, you're a veteran journalist. I mean, you served in a lot of important venues, a lot of important outlets as both a correspondent, you were an editor. What do you make of the sea change that we've been seeing in our profession that has taken place in the last few years, as even straight news reporters feel empowered to throw even the pretense of objectivity away? And in ways that would have been unimaginable, that would have been firing offenses in really not that long ago. What made this possible? Where we see, everybody knows about, certainly in the last administration, supposedly news correspondents debating the administration that they were supposed to be covering rather than asking questions. What made this possible, and where do you think this leads?
Well, I think it's dreadful and shameful and I find it very sad. I'm lucky to have been in the last generation of journalism where it was really a profession, and we knew I think we knew what we were supposed to do. Our job was not to tell good from bad, but tell truth from falsehood. That's what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to report. We were supposed to find out. But this is. I think this is just over with. I spent about half my full-time journalistic career at the New York Times, and I'm seriously sad to see what's happened there. What's happened there. When I was at the Times, editors and reporters knew there was a difference between news and analysis and opinion, and there were bright red lines among those things, and that was the way it was. And that was professionalism. I didn't want, as a journalist. Reporter, when I was a reporter, and I didn't get into opinion writing until middle age. no one should know what I actually think. And certainly the people I report on shouldn't know. They should all think Cliff's open to hearing what I have to say, and he reported me it fairly, and yeah, he reported the other side fair. But that's pretty much over now. Journalists are ideologues and propagandists, even at the most important, and particularly at the
especially at the most important
outlets.
ones.
But part of the reason also is economic, unfortunately, and that's the thing. So when you had advertisers, and that was the backbone for newspapers and TV, you didn't want to offend any of them, right? You wanted, and there's a whole history of that where I won't go in, where you have department stores and there you have trains and they want to tell people all over to come get their products. And so, because early on, newspapers were essentially partisan, factional broadsides. That's what they were. That's why some papers are called the Democrat
well, that was the original tradition.
It was the original tradition, right? It was a way to get your, but then it became professionalized, and much more so than it was ever in Europe. But it's becoming deprofessionalized now, because if you're even the New York Times, you want clicks, and you get clicks from people who agree, and as soon as they see something they don't like, they not only they stop clicking, they stop subscribing, they stop paying. When Bret Stephens I think he wrote his first column. It was a climate change column. It was like 30,000 people demanding he be fired immediately. And again, the New York Times, Barry Weiss left for this reason, no longer even has the idea that that there should be an editorial page and an op-editorial page which gives other opinions that are in opposition to the editorial page. You do see an occasional op-ed on the New York Times, but not much. And of course, you have ideologies and opinions, almost all from the left, infusing the news pieces as well. Not everybody, not everywhere. There are still some great reporters at the New York Times, mostly kind of old guys.
But there does seem to be an editorial in every headline.
Yeah, even in every headline. So I think it's really sad and bad for the world, because it's very hard now, harder than ever, for people to figure out what the truth is. And if you're only watching MSNBC, or even if you're only watching Fox, you have a whole different view of the world than we used to have. And so the community is very different from the days when everybody watched Walter Cronkite and everybody read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or maybe the LA. And there was a sort of broad consensus, and then there were the various opinions. And so what's happened to journalism is, to me, again, just distressing and sad, and I'm not sure maybe it comes back. Again, people like Barry Weiss are trying to do something very different and trying to give people ranges of opinions on her Substack. So maybe the market responds to all this. It's easy to be, I can get too pessimistic. I think it's also a common occupational hazard of journalists to be too pessimistic.
Yeah, well, we're always short-term pessimists,
yeah,
but we have to retain some long-term optimism. But even what you state, I mean, I think you're very right about, and I think part of it is ideological, part of it is sort of the culture of journalism today. I saw that just when I was reading something in the New York Times this morning, which was a review of Jonathan Karl, a longtime, White House correspondent for ABC News. He's written a memoir, and the review in the New York Times was scathing. Because they said, well, this is about your shortcomings because you didn't realize that you should have been partisan and trashing Trump from the beginning, and that your willingness to try to maintain objectivity for as long as you did was your real shortcoming. And that was, that's actually from the New York Times saying, you were too objective. You were too you weren't trying to editorialize the way we do. That is the nature of, but also that is what sells the New York Times digital subscriptions now. It's appealing to a left-wing base. Now, of course, this same trend created Fox News 25 years ago because, as famously as has been said, that Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch discovered an underserved niche of the American market that consisted of half of the American people, which is why it's so successful. And, new kinds of journalism like Substack, or frankly, new kinds of wire service organizations like JNS, We're giving people, in JNS, we're giving people news about Israel and the Middle East and other issues which they aren't getting elsewhere, opinions and analysis that they don't get from certainly from the liberal mainstream media. So yes, there is, water finds its level. There will always be a market if you're giving people something that they're not getting before, and if it's of any quality. But you're right, the consensus is gone. We live in a bifurcated nation, and that's why we are so at odds. That's why it's so hyper-partisan. That's why everybody is at each other's throats and have lost the ability even to listen to each other, let alone read, be able to tolerate an opinion article that you might disagree with.
No, that's right. And yeah, as you say, JNS is partly a market response too, and that's good. And maybe that helps. But I do think we have a problem that the commanding heights of the culture, the big newspapers, most not just MSNBC and CNN, but also CBS and ABC and certainly NPR and of course our universities. And Hollywood and most philanthropes have been taken over not by the moderate left, but by by wokery, by tribalists, by some really I was a kid. I grew up in like Greenwich Village, Chelsea, in New York. I knew loads of bohemians. I knew people with crazy political views, and I love them. They're great, and they're great. But the Bohemians have sort of taken over the commanding heights of the culture at this point, and you have people like President Biden agreeing with them, and you have plenty of people who don't agree but are afraid, for good reason, to disagree publicly because they'll not get tenure, they'll lose their position if they have it. So we're in a very dangerous period. Again, there are some, green shoots of sanity poking their heads up. I think that you saw that in Virginia, where, Glenn Youngkin said, look, I'm worried about the grocery tax. I think parents have a right to know what their kids are learning in school and have some influence over that process. And he seemed, pretty sane, and he won in a state where it was hard to win. And I think that's I consider that to be a good thing. I'm sorry to see that Terry McAuliffe did what he did, because he's not a radical by background, but when he goes out there and Democratic candidate for governor and says parents really, they should not be involved in their children's education. That's for the state. It's for the unions. And his last public appearance was with the union chief. He's totally on that side. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know why I thought that was a good way to go. But he was punished for it. Yes.
Well, that's a hopeful note. Yes, it's possible. We're still living in a democracy, and it's still possible to push back against bad woke ideas and hopefully to promote good ones. Cliff, we barely scratched the surface on a lot of these topics, but you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of real insights. I want to thank you for coming on. I want to thank our audience for tuning in wherever they are on podcast platforms such as Spotify, Amazon, Google, and the rest, or watching it on the JNS YouTube channel or later on JBS TV. We want to thank you for that. Please subscribe, give us good reviews wherever you're listening or watching. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, brought to you by the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. Visit us at JNS.org, and please follow at Amazon and Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts.